there's going to be a little housekeeping first, but welcome. Um, and happy Wednesday. I'm happy that it's 3 o'clock on a Wednesday. Can't lie. But welcome to our workshop today on faith podcasting. We hold these workshops regularly throughout the year on a variety of topics. We've had 3 workshops this week, and just check our website. There's a listing of upcoming workshops. I'm going to replace workshops with podcasts regularly in this workshop, so I'm sorry. It's just where my brain is right now. But we have a lot of workshops through the year on everything from podcasting to dealing with addiction to setting up endowments and everything in between.
Wow.
So check out our upcoming workshops. We'd be happy to have you all join us for those. And if you don't know, EPN is having their annual conference coming up February 25th to the 28th in Kansas City this year. I'm hoping it'll warm up a teeny bit. It's my Florida blood can't handle it anymore. And but registration's on our website if you haven't registered already. If you have, thank you. I look forward to meeting you all. I see a lot of people's names by email because I am the administrative resource. If you get emails from Laura Manley, the administrative resource, and have no idea what that is, that's me, and I do a little bit of everything, but my main job is working on these workshops with Joe, our executive director. But I'm looking forward to putting faces to names at our annual conference this year, and looking forward to meeting the new presiding bishop, Sean Rowe. He'll be joining us for a keynote conversation there. So I'm looking forward to meeting him and meeting all of you face to face. So, but I just want to say how grateful I am for Greg Knight and Liz Easton and Ricardo Avila from the popular, and I think Greg describes it as the largest Episcopal podcast on the internet.
The longest running.
Longest running. That's what it is. Longest running Episcopal podcast on the internet. So I'm really glad that you all have joined us today to talk about podcasting. It's a question we get a lot of. Should I start one? How do I start one? Why should I start one? Those kind of questions. So first, Greg, why don't you just start off? What is the Popping Collars podcast, and why is the Popping Collars podcast?
Oh, that's a great question. I'll take the second one first because, like most things in the Episcopal Church, this was a concept that was created on a Sunday school hall. And so, like most good things in the Episcopal Church, it was created on the Sunday school hall. So what ended up happening was that I was hired at the Church of Bethesda by the Sea down in Palm Beach, Florida, back in 2013. And when you're working Sunday school as a children's minister, it comes time to turn the rooms over to get ready for vacation Bible school and stuff like that. So you're taking sort of craft projects down, you're changing out bulletin boards, all of that stuff. And as I was doing that, I was like, well, I'll listen to some podcasts. There's got to be some great sort of faith-based podcasts that I would like to listen to that are out there. And there were definitely faith-based podcasts that were out there, but not the ones that were sort of in the vein that I was interested in, the sort of topics that I was interested in. So I was thinking, you know what? I know some very smart friends of mine from seminary. I think I can reach out to them and see if they would like to start talking about the things that we used to talk about in seminary. And so that's really kind of how it was born. It was born out of boredom while I was working to change Sunday school materials. How did we get here, though? It was such a, it was one of those things that it starts as like a silly idea, but quickly what you find is that you meet all kinds of wonderful people on this journey of ministry. And what I've found is that Popping Collars sort of serves as this guide to help reconnect me with people that I've known throughout my spiritual journey, my professional spiritual journey. And so as a result, I often like to think of the podcast as kind of like a bit of a homecoming every time we bring on sort of old friends, new friends, all of that stuff. So it's really sort of become this look back at all of the great folks that I've gotten to know over the course of my ministries, and then this sort of look forward at all the new people that we get to meet. So, yeah.
So, Liz or Ricardo, whoever would like to answer first, how did you get roped into this exactly, and why did you allow yourself to get roped into this?
Go ahead, Liz.
Good question. I was roped in by Greg. And our podcast has changed a lot over the years. What are we, Greg, 10 or 11 or
We are
12 years?
10 years strong at this point.
10 years. Okay.
Yeah.
And we had one format when we began, and we've held on to a piece of that until now. Right now, I think the best way to describe Popping Collars is more like a podcast network. We have a number of different shows that are on a like cycle. And then we have like our flagship operation, Popping Collars, which is basically like a round robin kind of panel discussion with the three of us, as well as one of our co-hosts, Betsy Carmody, who's the head chaplain at Episcopal High School in Alexandria. And so the four of us come together to do our thing. And then there are a number of other podcasts on different topics that populate our feed throughout the rest of the month. But I got roped in because Greg asked me to. I don't think I expected to be doing it for a decade. What it has become in my life is like a hobby and just a chance to reconnect with my friends. We like Greg and I have never seen each other in person in the last 15 years. And he's one of my closest friends. Betsy and I have run into each other more. Ricardo and I have more. Listeners of our podcast know that we once went to New York City to see Bruce Springsteen. That's a running joke on our podcast, but it's true. So I got roped in by Greg. I'm still here because of my friends. And I rarely remember anymore that it's a public conversation, which is a little dangerous. In the very beginning, I was hyper aware that every word that I said would be heard by someone who could get me in trouble for swearing or something like that. Now I'll have to be reminded by Greg, Liz, you've sworn too much in the last. You're gonna have to knock it off.
Every episode. For me, so Greg, Liz, and Betsy were original kind of co-hosts, and I got called in the second year or something, and I had guest co-hosted once. And Greg, he totally sweet talked me. Oh, it was just so good when you were on. The energy was high, and it was really, you should come on. And of course, that stroked my ego, and so I joined. And so I've been on like 8 years or 8.5. Greg, I don't even know. The thing Liz was talking about, I like to think of when it's just the four of us, I think of that as like the mothership. And then, so it's every Monday, some episode drops. But then there are what I call satellite pods. So Liz and I do the Popping Collars book club, when there's a fifth Monday. And then there's other satellites each week, like Going on 30 with the movie reviews. I would say that one thing that I have found interesting is a little bit like when I'm thinking about sermons during the week, like something will happen and I'll think, ooh, I want to put that in the sermon, or that's a good story or something. So I'll be reading a book or watching a movie or something, and I'll think, I want to recommend this book for the podcast. And so it's kind of seeped into my life in a good way because it makes me more aware of the pop culture that I am taking in. Which I like. And my favorite thing, of course, is getting together with the other three once a month to just gab. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah,
So,
I guess I should say I didn't necessarily describe the show, but at this point, it's been so long that I just kind of assume. But we do a pop culture and religion podcast, so we talk about where the intersection of where faith meets culture. The conceit of our pod is that we we believe that people make meaning out of the culture that they consume and the culture that's sort of around them. And so we sort of interrogate, we do a little bit of exegesis of like, well, what is that? Like, what meaning are people making out of these things? And where is the intersection of that with our faith stories and journeys and stuff? So, yeah.
okay, nice. So you touched on this a little bit, but so especially Liz did, is it odd having public conversations with each other, and how do you have to change your conversation, or do you just find that it's a natural conversation and it kind of flows to, in a way, because of your vocations as priests and teachers within the church and things like that, that it kind of naturally flows to this is a presentation as well as a conversation?
I would say that it has become pretty natural and did pretty quickly, just because our relationships were already so deep and we have a high level of trust. Each one of us is in incredibly different types of ministries that a professional Episcopalian might participate in, which has also really enriched our conversation. We've joked before that if we could have a subscription service for the first 30 minutes of our conversation, which is not recorded, it would be a lot hotter of a podcast, because we love to, we can be snarky, but we try to not be snarky when it comes to the podcast, because we're representing, I think, a more kind of, I don't know, what would you guys say? Like, I don't know, we're trying to be positive. We're trying to have some integrity with bringing people into this conversation. And I think it's because of our relationship and our trust that conversation is pretty easy in really technical ways too. Like, there have been many times that the morning after a podcast, I would call Greg and say, you know what, that thing that I said that felt really funny, I'd actually like you to cut that, or I didn't realize, or sometimes he'll come to us and say, did you mean to tell that story about your ministry context? Like, somebody might be able to tell the details. So that has really helped us a lot. We have such a high level of trust that we're able to do that.
Okay, good.
Can I say something about that too?
Of course.
I would say, yeah, like Liz said, it does feel natural now. I don't really, I'm the rector of a parish, and there's already some kind of built-in censoring that I do in my life, and it kind of transfers over to this. It's not like I become a raunchy, smoking, drinking potty mouth when we start recording. I'm kind of like this already, and I know, which I experience in some ways as loss. I don't get to be the fun, spunky, kind of goofy, crazy guy, but the goofiness is still there. And so the same with the podcast. And when Liz was talking about the pre-recorded stuff, there's just a lot of gossip. There's a lot of like, did you hear that blah, 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 and all this stuff. And it's great because we kind of get it out of our system so that we're ready to be a little more professional when the camera starts rolling. And then, of course, partway through, we might say, don't put this in the podcast, but I got to tell you this story or something.
Right.
And half the time, Greg talks us into leaving it in because it's so funny. Which is okay so far.
I will say this, like anything, and I imagine that we sort of experience this in our ministries, especially if you're clergy. You probably definitely experience this with sermon writing or with pastoral care or something like that. You sort of find your voice over time. Where we started is not where we are now. We were definitely sort of much more, as Liz said, hyper aware of what it was that we were saying. We were inviting more guests on, and I remember watching a Beatles documentary one time, and George Harrison saying that when they were recording, I think Let It Be, they brought in Billy Preston to play keyboards because they thought they would fight less if they had like a guest like in the middle of them. And so there is a bit of a dynamic too. When you bring in like an outside voice, it changes the way that you talk to each other. And so that's why we've sort of found that if we just keep it to the four of us, it sounds a little bit more like a conversation. And what our metrics sort of show in that vein is that people just kind of want to sit in and listen on a friend group talk to each other. Sometimes it matters what it is that we're talking about, but a lot of times it doesn't, because we're so comfortable with each other. It's become sort of this almost social relationship that people have with our conversations on the pod. So we tend to leave a lot more stuff in that, sort of bring out our personalities a little bit more. I would say, though, that, when it comes to podcasting, it's a lot like radio. It's a spectrum. You've got sort of NPR on one side, and you've got like shock jocks on the other. I think that, the majority, sorry, this is just based on listening, but the majority of Episcopal and faith-based pods tend to lean towards the NPR side, which doesn't really feel natural to me. So we tend to sort of zag a little bit, and we go not, full shock jock, but we go a little more lax on how it is that we talk. And I think that's helpful for folks who are just wanting an honest conversation about faith.
I was going to say that when we began, and even for many years, I think we were more explicitly theological. And I know that I myself would make a point of finding a way to talk about Jesus in every single episode. And that's still really important to me. I think that Episcopalians are not always the best at talking about Jesus specifically. So I would really try to do that. That has diminished a little bit over the years. And I think now what folks will find is a group of friends who are also Episcopalians talking with real sincerity about their lives and the culture that they engage with. And I think a lot of people are longing for that, especially younger folks. In many, many of our congregations now, if you are diving into your Episcopal faith, you may not immediately find a cohort of friends to have those discussions with and just hang out with. And to the extent that a lot of podcasts are parasocial, I fall asleep every night listening to My Favorite Murder. I feel like those girls are my friends. There is a way that people can hang out with us for a while. And I think that we never lose sight of that aspect of it.
Yeah. Do you have much engagement with the people who listen outside of just their listening? Do you get a lot of questions? Do you get people who send you suggestions? How does that work? Or are they putting
Ricardo's
you
shaking
on the
his head.
street and recognizing you?
No one
Ricardo's shaking his head because I frequently don't share this with the rest of the group.
Yeah.
Our interactions with fans.
I've gotten some. One of the things that's been really fun for me, I'm the canon to the ordinary of the Diocese of Nebraska, and I've gotten several cold calls over the years of folks who are discerning canon to the ordinary positions, and they'll call and say, I feel like I know you. You're the only canon to the ordinary that I know from the podcast. Can I talk through this discernment with you? And that is always such a gift and such a fun reminder that people are out there listening. Ricardo and I sometimes get book recommendations and book content from our book talk part of the podcast. And then we do have parishioners throughout Nebraska who sometimes will come up to me to say something about the pod, and I'm always like, ooh, did I say that? But I usually did, and I'm glad that they're listening.
Yeah, I have people I don't have anyone from the church who listens. Maybe I haven't promoted it well enough. One person who did listen to like a bunch of them, and then she left like a few months later. I don't think it was related, but who knows? No. I will say though, I've got some parishioners who are younger and younger for Episcopal, like in their 40s. And the wife listened to our episode on music we'd want to play at our funeral. And she loved it. And she started thinking of her own list. And then she's been listening to past episodes. And because they're really cool, I feel like I'm more cool because she liked what we talked about. So that's really it. Otherwise, Greg doesn't tell us anything, and I don't hear from anyone, except for one deacon that I know, Maureen, who is awesome and tells me she listens every week.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so this is where when we get into the sort of the metrics of the show, this is where things can get a little odd because, when we post a show, there's sort of a steep rise in downloads of that show, but the show just sort of constantly gets downloads. And, we've done over 300 episodes at this point. So, there are episodes from 8 years ago that are still getting downloaded right now. And so whenever anyone asks me like, how many downloads do you get per episode? It's hard to answer because it's like they're constantly getting downloaded. So it's, it's hard to say. So you basically just kind of have to go on how many average downloads you have per month, which, we're sort of in the thousands with that, which is great. But ultimately, we made a decision. I made a decision. I should own this, that, social media became sort of a really sort of anxious place for me to promote and market our podcast. It just became sort of a tool that I thought was, I was sort of ethically dubious of how it was that websites like Facebook and then Twitter, now X, were sort of promoting things or just how they were operating as businesses. And so we kind of took ourselves off of social media for a very long time. We've recently come back on because we have new initiatives that we would like to promote, and they're kind of like the only great way to sort of do mass marketing and promotion. And so as a result of being off of social media, we lost a lot of that sort of back and forth with audiences, but we do get emails, and that's how we've been getting feedback for a while now. So
Okay, awesome. So, Greg, how many people other than me have called you and said, how do you actually do this? Because I had a very short podcast, which is funny because when Liz was talking about the conversation before versus, and I think Greg mentioned versus the interviews, we had a podcast, and then my partner decided to go with her husband to France so he could be the dean of the American Cathedral, and it was like
that's
this.
all.
And
Boring.
and he just retired. Yay! So we might be getting back to it if we can overcome the, France, Florida time difference. But I came to you because we were like, oh, we think that there's some space for kind of that, like, friends chatting kind of about everything in like the midlife, especially for women, like what you're going through, taking care of parents, children aging out. I was going through a divorce at the time. She was going, they were going through, empty nest, and then husbands changing jobs and whatever. And then we ended up doing interviews. Like, it just, I saw a friend of ours happened to be releasing a book and whatever. And so we were like, oh, well, we should probably do it sooner rather than later. Greg, help. And I'm very thankful for that. But do you find yourselves getting a lot of questions about, hey, I love your podcast, how do I do that?
Nah. A lot of the requests we get is, hey, I've got a book. Can I be on your podcast? Or, hey, I've got a movie coming out. Can I be on your podcast? It's a lot of that. No, I think that that's such a great question, because we do get I do get emails from folks saying, I have this idea for a podcast, but I don't know quite what the next steps are and stuff. And what I always say is that, whenever you see podcasts in the Apple Store or Spotify or wherever it is that you get your podcasts, for you, it's just downloading these conversations, and you listen to people talk and you're like, oh, that's easy. I can really do that. And it is easy-ish to get a podcast uploaded to one of those sites. The thing, as we all know with most ministries, is that there's this upfront, there's the sort of front stage, stuff that looks really fun. And there's a lot of backstage work that gets the stuff to the front stage. The question you have to ask yourself is, do you have time to do all of the backstage work for the front stage stuff to look good, or to be something that you're proud of sort of putting out? What we found, and listen, we've been really honest about this with our listeners, I think, is that there are some moments in your life where you're really gung-ho and you're like, yes, this is a hobby that I want to put 10 hours into a week so that I can have these episodes come out every Monday. And there are phases of your life where you're like, if I have to edit another one of these freaking podcasts, I am going to chuck my laptop right out the window. And so I think that when it comes to the Episcopal Church, what I've found is that there are these really good initiatives and a lot of energy to start these initiatives and do it. And then after the work starts to pile up and, real life invades into these hobbies and stuff like that, there's this sort of, it's becoming like another job. I can't keep doing this, right? And I feel like there's like a 3 to 5 year span where that really happens. And you have to ask yourself, after like that 3 to 5 year lifespan, do I want to keep doing this kind of thing? Luckily, we've found that it is worth it for us to keep doing it. But for a lot of people, it may not be. And so I always tell people, when they have that journal of an idea, to jump into and do sort of digital content creation, they want to share it, I always say, okay, make a commitment to do it for a certain amount of time, and then give yourself time to reevaluate. Do I want to keep doing this? Because there's going to be a lot of extra work that goes into the finished product that you put out there.
Greg puts in the bulk of the work, so I don't even want to like pretend that I know anything about that. We show up, and I think Ricardo and I both have talked about, like, when it's approaching, you're like, oh my God, I have to record this stupid podcast. And then you do it, and it's like, I never want to quit. I love it so much. I will say though that this seems a little bit counterintuitive, but we have not monetized. And I think we've had a lot of opportunities to monetize over the years. And I think that that has actually helped a lot. There is a way in which this labor feels like a job. It is work, it is labor, but by not monetizing and keeping it as a hobby, to me, it has helped retain some of the joy and the flexibility. And I can call these guys and say, you know what, I thought I could record tonight and life has gotten in the way. I can't. Can we reschedule? And we've all been really gracious with each other about that.
I see Caitlin has a question that was going to be next on my list about, kind of the technical stuff about it, like how long, like for a 45-minute podcast episode, how much recording time, editing time, whatever, are you putting in advertising? Because it has to go on all these different platforms and they all have different requirements. And that was a steep learning curve for us when we did ours. We're like, hey, we're out there, and we're like, no, we're on this site, but we have to get onto Apple, and we have to get onto this, and and that was a shock. But how much time are you putting in for 145-minute episode?
Yeah. As you were asking that question, I was reading Caitlin's question too. I was like, it's almost like those step-by-step instructions on how to draw a horse, right? And it's like, make a triangle, make an open-sided oval, draw the rest of the horse. It's like, oh, okay. It's like it can feel sort of overwhelming eventually. Okay, so here's what I would say. On average, how long does it take to edit an episode? It kind of depends. It's going to depend on how much raw audio you have and how long of an episode you want to put out there. Our metrics when we first started showed that most folks were listening to our podcast for about 30 minutes, and then they were turning the podcast off. So at that point, we were thinking, okay, let's try to hit that 30-minute mark. But then eventually what ended up happening was that we started pushing closer to an hour, and we saw that people were sticking for that full hour. And so our podcast just kind of gradually got longer and longer as a result. Now we try to keep it to about an hour to an hour and 5 minutes, hour, 7 minutes, something like that. What that means though, is that for an hour and 7-minute episode, you're probably going to want about twice that in raw audio. And in order to edit, you're going to have to listen to all of that audio over again. And the real crazy part is, how do you want it to sound? Do you want it to sound like a natural, flowing conversation? If that's the case, then you're going to have to edit a lot of ums and uhs and likes and you knows and all the different things that we add in there. So that's a ton of micro edits. That's going to take a little while to get through. And then with our pod, what we found is that since we're doing content creation and we're really doing commentary on pop culture, we're actually within the realm of fair use as far as clips are concerned when it comes to movies or music or something like that. We're able to use segments of materials because we're commenting on that material and we're making a new thing using the material. So as a result, I would say that, per episode, 3 to 5 hours to edit an episode of the pod. And that's because you're listening back through the pod, you're finding sound clips, you're downloading them, you're putting them back in, you're you're doing micro edits and stuff like that. And then usually you're going to give it a last minute listen to make sure that you didn't accidentally leave a curse word from Liz in there. And so, that's going to take a little while too. And then just like Laura said, you're uploading reels to Instagram to promote the pod, you're posting, at this point now, we're also doing some YouTube clips along with the pod. So we're pulling video from the podcast and posting those on YouTube. So it's like now we're getting up to like 10 hours per episode. And again, it becomes a question of, is that something that you want to do? And, is it worth it for you, I guess?
But that's about form also, right? So like if you are doing our conversation our podcast is a conversation most of the time between four friends, and we talk over each other and we laugh and someone's kid runs into the room or whatever. But if you were doing a more straight, like a sermon, for example, or a Bible study, a sermon prep, like something that was more scripted, you might not be having to do that amount of editing. Plus our conversation, Greg, I mean, sometimes we talk for 3 hours that you edit down from there.
Yeah. Yeah. As far as how we edit, honestly, like, here's the thing. There may be folks on this conversation that have better ways. Oh, Descript. There you go. That's probably better than what we're using. We're using actually, because I was getting into it as like a hobby and just Googled like, how do I start a podcast? Just like a rookie. I ended up finding an open source, which is Audacity, which has everything that I kind of need to edit audio on it, and it's free. And so I just downloaded it and I edit everything on there. We started as an audio only pod, so I never really concerned myself with video at all. Like, it just wasn't something we were doing. We recently switched to YouTube because I don't know if you know this, but Google shut down their podcast manager. Google Podcasts no longer exists. They're putting all of their pods onto YouTube now. So the RSS feed, which is the source code for our podcast that gets sent to like all these different websites to post our podcast. The RSS feed that was going to the Google Podcast site is now going to YouTube. So our podcast shows up as a YouTube video, even though it's just audio. And so I was like, well, if we're already on a YouTube platform, let's just go ahead and pull some of the video as like a preview clip or like a, promotional clip, that then we can sort of look to build the YouTube platform going forward, because we actually have projects in the pipeline that we're going to be looking to do more video with. And so that gets our feet kind of wet in that space.
And I know that you took some of our, Greg and I used to work together at an Episcopal church, and he took some of our adult forums and made those into a podcast. It was a little more relaxed, I would say. So what was that, quote unquote, easier, or is it harder in some ways? Like, how does that compare to what you do as more of the conversational?
Sure. Yeah. So in a lot of ways, it's actually easier to do, like, to just record a forum and then post it, because you don't really have to edit that much. Like, the only thing that I would say that I would caution about with that is just make sure that you have a good sort of 360 microphone that can record the entire room, because a lot of times forums will end with Q&As, and if you just have sort of the standard projection microphones for the room, those don't come through great over the podcast audio. So I always kind of made sure that I had like one of those 360 microphones in the room that could get better audio when it came to the Q&As from the crowd, because not everybody's mic'd up. Only you and your guests are usually mic'd. So, but But yeah, that one requires fewer edits because you're basically just recording the conversation and then just uploading that conversation. You may want to record an intro to, expand on who your guest is and why they're there for you. And you may want to do an outro to promote future conversations that you're having if this is part of a series. But otherwise, it's pretty much just record, grab that audio, throw it into the Google machine, and make a podcast.
I was going to say, someone in the comments asked how we fit this into our day jobs.
Yeah.
And I think that for all of us, this is not a ministry of our churches or institutions. So we do it late at night, and that's tough. That would be a different thing, I'm sure, if you were doing a series that came from your church and that was part of your job. But for us, it has all been at night, and especially Greg and Betsy, who are on the East Coast. Like, I do not know how they do it, because I am done when we're when we're done recording. I am usually one that's like, guys, it's late.
Yeah.
But that's typically how we've done it.
Right. And I'm on the West Coast and I haven't had my dinner, and it's like, guys, it's 9 o'clock. I haven't eaten yet.
Oh no.
Can I say a little something? I don't know, Greg, if you're about to say something, but I just I'm picturing like, oh, here's some people coming to this talk we're having.
Mhm.
And if I were thinking about starting a podcast, because I'm on a podcast, but I don't do any of the work that Greg does. Like, I've heard some really professional podcasts. Like, I think, Liz, you alluded to this. It's like, wow, that's not our podcast. That's so professional. And ooh, we're kind of this like scrappy. Oh, I feel like a little bad. But then I hear a podcast and I think it's fun. I think we're having a great time. And I think the charm and the energy of it is from the relationships and talking about pop culture. So if you're starting a podcast and you're shooting for those, really professional sounding things, that's one thing. But know that you're doing that, because I think I couldn't do a podcast like that if more was required of me. Just bringing myself and my love of pop culture that I know seems enough for this. And so I almost want to say, start something that you love. Like, I don't know, don't start a podcast maybe for like, oh, I think people need to hear about this.
Yeah.
But maybe start a podcast of, God, I so love this author or this thing. And I want to talk to people about it. So I'm going to put it out there. So like, have it come from here, not like it's over there and it's needed. So I'm going to go over there and make it happen, because I think you get energy from that. And I certainly didn't think I'd be doing this for 8.5 years myself.
Yeah, I mean, that's the authenticity and the honesty angle of it, right? I mean, like, so often, especially nowadays, right, you'll hear folks say, oh, I want to do like a progressive response to like a Joe Rogan podcast or something like that. Well, I mean, Joe Rogan has like a very specific way of doing things. Like, are you going to sort of map that technique onto, like, I mean, is that authentic to who you are? Or are you just trying to put an alternative voice out into the world? What we've found is that the more authentic you are, the more sort of you're tapping into the folks that are really curious. And curiosity is, I mean, the title of this is like reaching the seeker. I feel like that's what we're kind of doing, is like, hey, have you ever talked to your friends about Harry Potter and thought, man, there's some Jesus stuff in here? That's what we're doing, right? And so if you're the kind of person who's like, I don't go to church, but I'm okay with some Harry Potter stuff, that sounds pretty cool. Like, it's helpful to have an easy conversation rather than like an intellectual conversation, because then people feel like they can sort of jump in. I feel like, when it comes to the pod, there's a couple of things that we kind of keep in mind. One is, what is our goal? Our goal is to look at the world around us and to sort of make sense about how people are making meaning out of it. And then the other thing is, who is our audience? And I think our audience are people who are a little curious about Jesus, but definitely are, into sort of consumer culture, whatever that is, right? And we try to hit a variety of different topics. And as a result, I think that like it creates an honest, relationship-based space for those people to kind of come in. And at the end of the day, like, that's what the best churches are places where you can be yourself and be in relationship and belong with other people. We're just kind of creating a space to do that around something that you may love, like Bluey, or I don't know, My Little Pony, or Transformers, or I don't know, whatever you're into. Books like Liz and Ricardo, you know. So yeah,
Yeah.
so that's what I would say is, like, you know, your authentic voice, whatever that is, that's going to be what people want to listen to, not like whatever, you know, character you want to create for yourself, kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. And sometimes you have to ask yourself, you know, does this deserve to be a podcast, or is this better in a smaller group or a local group or a different type of format? I mean, the reason that Eli Harlan and I started ours is we talked about, you know, she and I had really great conversations about what was going on in our, you know, empty nesting stage and all that stuff. But we wished, you know, but we knew that she was moving on and I had moved quite a bit and whatever. And so a lot of times when you come into that space, you wish you had someone who was like a step or two ahead of you that you felt you could open up to right away. And because we're so transient in a lot of ways, or because we were just coming off the pandemic when we started, so a lot of people were isolated at home, we decided, well, what if we could be those people that, you know, we're just the friends having the talk and you can listen in, maybe send us a question if you were interested, but just to know that someone out there is having that conversation and give people courage to have that conversation. So, but on the other hand, Greg and I have a film group that we do that is not a podcast. He does a film podcast here, and then we have a small group that we meet with. They all happen to be local, but you know, we all talk and meet in person or on Zoom locally because, you know, some of our participants have gone to college, or, you know, they spend the summer in a different state or whatever. So that's worked out. And plus it started over the pandemic, so it was easier to do on Zoom, and then just kind of stayed there. But you know, so sometimes you have to ask, you know, am I being called to a podcast, or am I being called to a book club or a movie group or a meetup group or a something, you know, what would be the best way for me to fulfill this thing that I feel, you know, should I write a book? You know, that kind of a thing. So you know, that's another question I think that has to get asked too. And you know, and I think that that's what, you know, when Greg was talking about, you know, he heard like, oh, I have things to do, I want to listen to a podcast that meets these things, and he didn't have it. That's another way of kind of discerning that desire and that call, because I think it is a call. I think, you know, just because you're not getting financially paid for it doesn't mean it's not a calling and it's not a vocation. And I think you guys do a great job with the podcast, and I know I enjoy it. I've visited as a guest a couple of times, and I still have disagreements with Greg about the, I don't know, where Robert De Niro should fall in that stardom list, but but you know, that kind of thing. But you know, it's just kind of fun, you know, it's another way of being creative, and it's another way of serving. So
Yeah, something that you just said there, Laura, about ownership, you know, there's a question about that in
yeah,
the
love
chat I
it.
saw. This is great. I feel like a Twitch streamer, and like I should be like playing video games and like, hey chat. Oh, I see somebody has a question.
Uh-huh. Like the
So
past 5 months.
yeah, that's this idea of who owns the podcast. So Liz has mentioned we've been offered, yeah, the opportunities to monetize, to do some ads and stuff like that, to sort of feature things on the pod. And you know, there's never been something that's really struck us as like, oh man, we've got to do that. And I've always thought, like, you know, there's something too about being independent that allows you to keep your voice and allows you to know that what it is that you're putting out there is what you want to put out there and not what somebody else wants to put out there. So for instance, we have guests on our pod that are interview guests, and these are like directors and actors and authors that we'll feature. As a matter of fact, our most recent episode is the author of a book about trans teenagers and how they're surviving in the country today. That's really amazing. It was great to be able to talk to them. Would I be able to do that interview if I had some kind of, backer or something? I don't know. Right. So there's a type of freedom that comes with being an independent podcast and just sort of making our own stuff. Yeah, it costs us a little bit to be independent, but at the end of the day, we know that what we're producing is something that we believe in, right? And
Do
we're
you
not
own our podcast though? Like, who owns the content?
Oh, it's me. Yeah, it's me.
You're the boss. Oh wow, I didn't
Well
realize.
deserved. Well deserved.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
totally. Can I say
Of course.
just about just the phrase passionate slacker. I mean, I kind of I like that about this podcast. We can just
I
sort of
love
show up and like, oh, I'm not prepared or anything, and then just as the conversation goes, you're like, oh yeah, yeah, da da da, and you get kind of really into it. And again, having that thing hanging over you of somebody owning the podcast, you've got to produce. That's I wouldn't stay. But the other thing I wanted to say, backtrack a little. um how do you fit this into your day job thing, that question about, so again, being clergy, yeah, we do it at night, but a different way to look at that question for me is like, how does that actually inform your ministry? And I used to put in kind of references to pop culture, and for me pop culture includes like Charles Dickens and Dostoevsky, just to be clear. But I I it informs my preaching, and it informs how I present Bible study classes. Of, oh, well, that's like that Taylor Swift song or something. And in a weird way, I think it ennobles both. I think it ennobles my sermons because it actually makes them more relatable. I love the scriptures, but I think sometimes when I hear a great audiobook, it moves and inspires me in ways that scripture doesn't always. And I think that's valid because it's all about, how we relate to each other. So I would just say it also fits into my day job in ways that kind of lift it up and make it more personal and relational. And pop culture, with when you look at it with the lens of religion, it's like, oh wow, that was pretty deep what they said about that. I'm yeah. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah.
So don't
I,
be
I
afraid
will
to.
say this. Yeah, whenever anyone sort of comes with an idea, I never want to discourage them from making stuff. I think that it is a testament to our denomination as Episcopalians that, there are constantly people creating things and doing just sort of amazing work. And it's like, oh, this is great. Um, what I never want is for someone to sort of go into something without sort of their eyes wide open. And so I try to help folks know that, like, yeah, that's a great idea. Just know that there may be a little bit more work than you think, because the deceptive part of podcasting and even YouTube creation is that it looks really easy. And if you Google it and you're like, how do I do this? Like, the step by steps are actually really easy to get on. The devil is kind of in the details, which is, do you want to expand? Do you want it to sound a little bit better? Do you want to go a little bit further? And it's almost like microtransactions on like a cell phone game or something, where it's like, it's really easy to download the game, but now it's like costing me $5. Think of those $5 as like time. And like, the more you want to progress with this stuff, you're kind of spending time to progress, right? And so it becomes a question of, is that time, does that time that you're putting into this hobby take away from your professional ministry, yeah, or add to it, like Ricardo was saying. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and I found that the pop culture connection is really helpful, which is why I like your all's podcast. And a few years ago, I was trying to explain what Lectio Divina was to someone. And there's this great podcast called Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. And it goes through Harry Potter chapter by chapter using Lectio Divina to
Whoa.
talk about the spirituality of Harry Potter and to talk to how to read a text and kind of take it apart but people get nervous doing that with the scripture because they feel like there's a right way or a wrong way. But doing it to Harry Potter, I mean, it's just a piece of kids literature. What's the harm in tearing that apart? So that's one that I recommended to people because I got a lot out of it. And I've been practicing Lectio Divina for a while now, but it kind of rejuvenated my passion for it. It was really fun. And I kind of think of our film group as like a Visio Divina, right? It's taking this visual medium and going, oh, what's this? It's a soft way of going into something without it feeling like, oh no, you're going into a theology class all of a sudden. You have to be in seminary to be able to do this thing. And just making it more accessible to everybody. So yeah, I think pop culture is just a great way to go into some of those topics because they don't feel as scary for people to wade into.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of a hack, right? Because it's like you're never going to run out of it. They're constantly making stuff, so as long as you kind of stay current, you can still do it. But also what we find with our pod, just like Ricardo mentioned with Dickens and Dostoevsky and Liz with her true crime. It's one of these things too where it's like there's such a diverse slate of offerings that are out there that sometimes people don't know. And one of the things I'm really proud of about our show is that we'll talk about Drag Race, or we'll talk about like RuPaul's Drag Race, or we'll feature interviews with like up and coming black filmmakers and stuff like that. And it's like, the other side of pop culture is that there are folks who are trying to get their voices out there, and we become this platform to sort of lift up these other things. It's not that Yellowstone isn't great. It is, I guess, but there's all these little things out there that are also popular culture, but they kind of are working in this sort of progressive, justice space too. And so giving voice to those things is always like really great. I always love it when Ricardo and Liz recommend a book that I'm like, oh my gosh, there's some really good stuff in here. I never knew this book even existed, kind of thing. And that's the benefit of doing a pop culture pod too.
I wanted to say really quickly, and I don't know if this fits in, but the Episcopal Church is historically and I think appropriately suspicious of self-promotion.
Yeah.
And we all know this. There's a difference between being a person striving to be an influencer on their own merit versus trying to lift up a ministry, share the gospel, share the story of our church to a wider audience. And the Episcopal Church has a very finely tuned ability to carve out the influencer. And I think that doing a podcast with friends has helped prevent all of us from falling into that hubris. That because we're friends, we're able to sort of hold each other accountable and be really real. And we know each other's ministries and we know each other's values. And we've been able, as Greg says, to be able to sort of platform and uplift other people without falling into a trap that I think a lot of Episcopal media can do of platforming the creator. And I actually really love it when people don't know that I have a podcast. I think that that's a good sign that it's fitting into my ministry in an appropriate way. I don't know if that makes sense, but it felt like something I wanted to say.
Nice. Yeah, and we had a question specifically about, going back to Greg mentioning the kind of the seeker concept that we were kind of mentioning as the title of this podcast. Like, is there a way that you kind of attract people from who aren't insiders, so to speak, in the Episcopal Church? Like, do you use like hashtags, or do you just, how do you get to that audience, or do you make a conscious effort to
Yeah, so sorry, go ahead,
I
Liz.
just wanted to say quickly, we don't in our like the searchability of our podcast episodes does not feature the Episcopal Church. And I think that is a good thing. If you wanted to if you were interested in a topic, you might find us through searching for that topic and find our podcast. And I also think, I don't know about you all, but for me, whenever I like want to learn about like taking electrolytes after working out, or like whatever I want to learn about, I am very likely to turn to a podcast and listen to one episode and sort of get that in my ears. So I think that that's something that people are doing too. They're reaching out to the podcast space. If they're curious about, it's not that we don't mention the Episcopal Church, but from a searchability function, there are other ways to find us. Go, I interrupted you, Greg.
No, you're fine. I was just going to say that you're totally right as far as like what we think of our search engines. It's not just Google and Yahoo. It's like it's YouTube, it's Spotify. Like people are using, platforms in order to search ideas or topics. It is a bit of a, I will say this, and I think that most people kind of know this that are, in kind of any professional institution where they have to kind of market themselves, is that the bigger you are, the more you're seen. I mean, that's just kind of what it is, right? I mean, that's just kind of how American brains work. So it is kind of a bit of a rigged game where, the more of an audience you have, the more likely you're going to show up in like search engines or on Apple's, top religion and spirituality podcasts or something like that. And that was actually one of the things that we kicked around, I think it was last year or the year before, was like, listen, okay, we already have this platform where we have a lot of listeners. And the only reason that we have a lot of listeners, it's not because we're good, you guys. The reason that we have a lot of listeners is because we didn't come in at the ground floor, but we came in like, our podcast came in before Serial was a podcast, right? And Serial was like the big, like, just, gate crashing podcast that like, there are still people that think it was the first podcast ever made, right? And so as a result of our longevity, we've built up an audience. That's why we have an audience. But I remember saying to the group, I was like, what if like somebody wants to start a podcast and we just say, we'll host you on our site. So if you make a podcast, edit it together, make a thing, and we'll just say, we'll put you in the Popping Collars feed. And then at least that way you get like, 2,000, 3,000 people, 4,000 people to listen to you. And then you can start your own podcast. And at least you have like a little bit of a primer, because right now, I think what you're going to find, especially if you're starting something new, is that like you're putting it out there and like a dozen people are listening and you're like, oh my gosh, this isn't worth it, kind of thing. And it's only because the market is just so saturated with stuff, right? So the people that find us, they find us through like searching. Are far and away most downloaded. I think I just clocked it at like 78,000 downloads or something like that, is our Christmas episode. And the only reason is because it's titled Christmas and people go to Pandora like the day after Thanksgiving and they type in Christmas and click on the podcast link, and our pod just gets played over and over and over and over again. It's just one of those things where it's like, because we've got all of those plays on that platform, we're more likely to show up for everybody else, right? So yeah, what Liz is saying is right, is that the seeker, they're not looking for us in particular, but they're finding us through search engine optimization, basically.
The Pandora thing is just a hilarious example of like how algorithms work, that we're the #1 Christmas podcast on Pandora from 2018 or something. It's like, it's this super specific, weird thing.
By the way, that is a good Christmas episode.
By the way, it is a wonderful episode. If you listen to nothing else that we do, listen to that episode, if only to hear Ricardo talk about the wonderful sort of moral and ethical underpinnings of It's a Wonderful Life.
There you go.
He
Tearjerker.
cries at the end of it. He has all of us crying. It's amazing.
Oh,
So
that's
I
wonderful.
listened to it with my bishop on a trip to visit a church, and he cried. Like my dad cried. Everyone I know who listened to that podcast cried.
If
It's
you can make a bishop cry, you are good. You're done.
for my bishop, that's not hard to do.
No. So we have one last question and then we're going to have to wrap up. But do you even optimize those? Do you try to optimize and like rig the system? Like, have you you've gotten, I'm sure everyone here has gotten like that Instagram post or that social media post that has like J-Lo hashtagged with like country cooking and, the 2024 election and all that stuff to try to hit as many things as possible, And so thank you, Whitney, for coming. But do you try to, play the algorithms that way, or do you just let the spirit bring people to you?
yeah, no, I don't. I just don't have time to game Twitter that way, And honestly, like anyone who's like searching trending topics and then hashtagging their posts with like everything that's trending right now, what like attorney general hearing or whatever's going on right now, they're not serious posts anyway, right? Like if you're like me, you're ignoring any posts that are doing that, right? So I don't find that to be a really successful, or even just I think that's mostly bots like fishing for engagement. What I find is like, actually, honestly, if you want to know how we've optimized search engine, it's stick to keywords that are close together. So religion and pop culture shows up frequently on our website. So like that sort of forward phrase, religion and pop culture, religion and pop culture, religion and pop culture, so that when somebody searches religion and pop culture, like they get 8,000 hits from our website, right? The other thing too is I find it's great to sort of keep things simple. It's fun to have like catchy little titles for episodes and stuff like that. But if you just title something Christmas like we did, like you're likely to show up in a search a lot better than like deck the halls with theological learning or something. I don't know. Like, it's just sort of like sometimes the most direct approach is the best approach, I think. And it's not about overthinking it. It's about just sort of thinking to yourself, if I were hunting down keywords, what are the ones that I would use? And then just put those in the description of your episode,
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much, Liz and Greg and Ricardo. You guys have been awesome. This has been great. I feel like I'm visiting Popping College again, and this is a lot of fun. So thanks. I mean, this is basically their podcast. So just, about books or movies or, whatever random crazy thing just happened in the news that they can relate to, books or movies. And so, or music. Yeah, there's some great music episodes that I really love. So thank you guys for coming. We really appreciate you being here. And, maybe we can do this again sometime, but thank you so much. This is great information.
Thanks, Laura.
Thank you.
Take
It was
care.
great seeing you all.
You too.
Bye.